When you're talking about schizophrenic literature today, there is one unavoidable name and unavoidable body of things, and that's Beckett. So I would propose to do, I would suggest that we do Beckett, and indeed do maybe the most schizophrenic text of Beckett, which is the long fragment What, which is his last English, I guess his last English thing. Then I would suggest, and then that's also readily available for change. Since Beckett is an establishment writer, unlike Lewis, who is sort of kind of a non-classifiable. Then for a postmodernist text, obviously there are also lots of possibilities. You know, the standard is Borges, for example, or any of those things. But I happen to think, okay, we could have a choice there, because there's a kind of precursor of all this, which I think is a very important book historically, and a very great book, and one that one can reread with lots of interest, although it's a little bit earlier than what one thinks of as postmodernism. That's the Nabokov's Lolita. Or the other work that I would propose, partly because I've worked on it and because I like it and I think it's a marvelous book, and because this is also, I guess, really the dominant writer of postmodernism, if that's what you want to call it, I would suggest something of Pynchon, and then at that point, length suggest that The Crying of Lot 49 is the obvious choice, and besides, I think it's the best, you know. And that's a short work which we can get. Now, how do you feel about this? Do people have suggestions, other texts? Of course, we could all think of what our favorite texts are and start to. But I mean, are there things that you see more that sort of impose themselves, subjects that impose themselves more readily than those? How do you feel about this choice of things? Yeah.
What about French?
Well, sure. There would be Aubrier or people like that to do. Yeah. I guess I'm not too enthusiastic. I mean, Aubrier, I think, is a very important writer, but I feel that those, how can I put it, maybe those things are a little less, these things, Beckett and Pynchon and Nabokov in a very different way are sort of natural events. I mean, they kind of happen and they're there, and then you, like Lewis, then you have to try to explain them, whereas it's clear that Aubrier, but also even more Butour, knew what they were doing. They thought it up ahead of time and planned it that way. And so in a way, for me, although I like Aubrier a lot, I don't like Butour very much. That's sort of less interesting. And we are in a kind of English language tradition, I guess, here with this Conrad and Lewis, and so that sort of keeps that. But if everybody wants to do that, sure, we could do it. How do the rest of you feel? Any objections to these proposals? Well, what about as between Nabokov and Pynchon? How do you feel about that? How many prefer Pynchon? How many prefer Nabokov? Well, I think it looks like Pynchon has, and in a way that's more contemporary, and I think in some ways raises generic problems that are sort of interesting. Okay, let me go ahead with this then. I'll order at Bob Miller's bookstore there, I'll order some copies of Watt, which is in the Grove Press thing, I guess, and some copies of The Crying of Lot 49. That is that will take a little bit longer to come, because that's also coming from a foreign country, but a closer one, and so it only takes a month, and in that case. The Brishno, yeah, look, I don't think I'll order the, why don't we Xerox it? Did you find that in English? Yeah. Okay, why don't we Xerox a few copies and have that available up in Complet then, and that will be on our agenda. All right, so much then for the rest of this, the other schizophrenic book, if you read French, that's sort of interesting to look at is, the book that Deleuze likes, and that he mentions that no one really knows about or has read. It's called La Grande Pâque, It's by somebody named Jacques Besse, B-E-S-S-E, and I don't know if you have it in the library here, but it's a long kind of schizophrenic promenade, about 100 pages, and he's got some other things in there which are less interesting. But Deleuze says it's a marvelous book. It really is sort of a marvelous book, and it's worth looking at, if only because then you're the only one in your block who's ever read this schizophrenic text, and who knows who Jacques Besse is. I assume it's essentially, you know, he's some kind of writer, but it is a kind of schizophrenic memoir. I mean, clearly he's somebody who's been in and out of institutions. And I'm sure there are other documents of this kind one would want to draw on, but we can sort of you draw on them in making a kind of general theory of the stuff yet.
There's one sort of local, so to speak, also by Jacques Ferrand, Les Roses Sauvages.
Les Roses Sauvages. Well, maybe we should look at that then. Is that a recent?
It's a few years ago.
Jacques
French Canadian.
Ferrand.
And in it, he has a kind of something like the one you just described, Une lettre d'amour, which is barely fictionalized.
Mm-hmm.
Dealing with something.
Well, let's add that to our sort of corpus of materials in this area, and because then it may be that as we read some of these things, we might want to zero in more closely on one or the other of these things too. Okay, now coming back to Tar, what I want to do today is I want to use this work. I want to eventually arrive at a point where we can make some kind of more general structural characterization of modernism, and particularly of these two modernisms that we've looked at. I think we're not yet at that point. So for the moment, we're still enumerating the features of this thing, seeing how it's organized, and what kinds of things go on in it, and what kinds of systems are floating around in it, so to speak. We were working on a kind of closer level of analysis, this whole scene with Bertha, which is in your text pages, well, let's see, pages, the fourth part of chapter, of part one, that is pages 41 on. I'll come back to that in a second. I've written some stuff on this in this article on Lewis, and I don't want to repeat everything that I said, but because you can find it there, and it would be a kind of waste of our time. But I think, and I don't still think those things exactly in the same way, but there are a few things that I wanted to readapt from that essay. It's that in a way, what you have here is a kind of process of reconstruction of a new text. Now, I talked about subtext before, so I can't use that word again in this context, but or maybe I will, but then remember that I don't mean the same thing. What we have here is a kind of formation of a new artificial text out of the fragments of an underlying text. Now, in other words, what's happened, it seems to me, well, one can use a lot of different images or figures for this process, and one of the ones we're going to be looking at when we get to Deleuze is this whole terminology of flux and coding and recoding. It seems to me that it's pretty clear, it already was becoming clear in Conrad that the external world, for whatever reason, was falling apart. That is, was somehow returning to some state of being a kind of primal flux in which everything breaks down into its smallest parts, whether those are sense data, random objects, pieces of objects, pieces of gestures, and so on and so forth. Now, why this happens is harder to say, that is, historically. I think we always have to remember this paradox that, I mean, this is clear in all modern writing, you know, it's not just these people. It's clear that that the really powerful modern writing is based on an experience of the formlessness of the universe, so to speak. And its official ideology, and the official ideology of most modernisms, has been that of form giving. So the modernist writer, I guess this is most purely expressed in somebody like Wallace Stevens, the whole idea of the necessary fiction and all that stuff. So that the modernist writer carves himself a place in this situation, which is that of restoring some unity to a mass of fragments which are supposed not to have any unity. Now, in that form, this takes the form of metaphysic, and essentially, again, a kind of proto-existentialism. It's because the world is absurd and meaningless that art and the mind and so on have as their task to impose a meaning, or, if you like, in real existentialism, to face the fact that there is meaninglessness and so on and so forth. I don't think we can accept that viewpoint, if only for this paradoxical reason. That is, I think people might very well be willing to accept the idea that nature is meaningless, that organic life is an accident or something. I guess that's the thesis of Monod in Chance and Necessity, although I think that's been disproved or something. I mean, Monod claims that mathematically the chances of the combinations for life, you know, of these molecules and so on are so unlikely that this is a one-time thing. But it seems to me recently everybody talks about the creation of life as being perfectly banal, and that on the contrary, it's sort of part of the structure of, it's one of the very natural tendencies in the structure of matter. I don't know about that, but at any rate, it seems possible that one could believe, you know, that life is an accident, and that organic life, at least as far as we're concerned, has no particular meaning, and that it's absurd in that sense. But we're not talking about organic life. We're not talking about the meaninglessness of nature or of life itself and life and death. We're talking about the meaninglessness, an experience of the meaninglessness of an essentially humanized object world, of an object world which has been totally remade by human beings. And completely filled with, mastered to the point where it's even a question whether nature, anything of nature can survive. That is, where a world which is completely a world of anti-physis, as Sartre says, that is, of the non-natural, the result of human production. And at that point, then, clearly, if you take the famous thing of Vico, that at least whatever the truth about organic nature, human beings can understand what they've made. Well, then at that point it becomes extremely paradoxical that it should be in the face of this total experience of humanization, of a transformation of the natural world into a human world by production. It's in the face of a complete, of a saturating process like that this experience of meaninglessness is had. And that suddenly this completely human world, in which we ought to see ourselves, is experienced as nothing but a lot of broken fragments. So I would say that it must be the case that the metaphysic of the absurd is just that, is a metaphysic, and has ulterior motives, and is an ideology, and all the rest of it. And we must search elsewhere for some adequate explanation of this omnipresent experience of meaninglessness and of fragmentation and of the flux and so forth, which is, I think, has to be present in every great modern artist of consequence, because in a way that's the signal that these writers or artists have touched something which is fundamental in everybody's lives, and it's what makes their work unconventional. Well, however they then explain this experience. Well, in the Marxist tradition, the way of accounting for this is, I think, both a simple and a very persuasive one to my mind. It's that this is what one calls reification. And therefore, and the concept of reification is a twofold one that allows one to explain, and this is what we have to explain, you see. It allows one to explain the surface appearance of meaninglessness of this object world, and its underlying, the cause of that appearance in underlying reality. That is, it allows us to understand the flux as an illusion, but as a structural illusion, as a necessary illusion produced by an underlying system, which is itself, far from being meaningless, only too meaningful and lawful. So the notion of reification, as Lukács develops it out of Weber, but of course also ultimately out of Capital itself, is one in which the very production of commodities creates a kind of wall of objects, a kind of surface of the external world, which it becomes, which is somehow so massive that for a number of different reasons, we're unable to understand that this is an illusion, but rather we experience the reality of this illusion directly in the form of this flux, of this meaninglessness, of this bombardment by object fragmentation, all the rest of it. Now, the reasons why, one can give various explanations why this is, why we don't understand this as an illusion, why this is the reality of our daily life that we live, the existential reality of our daily life, as opposed to the underlying laws of this existence. Well, one of the reasons is we don't want to know it. That is to say, it's very important for people who consume all these objects not to be aware of something that would otherwise be quite intolerable, namely that all these objects are being produced by other people for us, and so on and so forth. That is, were we to see our world as it really is, we would see not objects, but group relationships. And we would see ourselves as a class in relationship to a producing class, into production, and so on. And that's a very painful thing. It's part of the whole structural vision of life, or ideology, if you prefer, of the bourgeoisie, not to believe in classes and class consciousness and those things, and class struggle. And therefore, these are all things which are structurally repressed from our consciousness for all these reasons. That is, the way in Freud you repress something because it causes anxiety. Well, this causes anxiety. It would cause all kinds of problems in our daily lives if we had to remember this all the time, that people are working and producing things and so on. So this becomes an important, I'm describing this on a psychological level. On a more objective level, it would seem that it's part of the whole process of producing these objects to somehow conceal their relation to labor power and so forth. That is, there is something structural in the commodity form is itself, as Marx says, a form of fetishism. It is a structural disguise. It is a kind of compromise formation in which production and labor power are repressed, and in which this act of production comes before us in the form of an object and so forth. So this structural illusion is present in the very nature of this economic system, and therefore this is not a matter of individual delusion, nor is it something that can be rectified really by pedagogical teaching. You know, I can tell you about production, so on and so on, but that's not. It's only changed by praxis. It's not really changed in intellectual ways like that. It is really, so it's not an illusion in that sense. It's the reality of our daily life, but that whole daily life is in a way a kind of structural illusion or an appearance behind which there is this underlying reality. Okay, well, at any rate, it seems to me that some such explanation is necessary in order to account for this paradox of the situation of modernism that I described a moment ago, and obviously this can be registered in a lot of different ways. We saw, and we made some tables of these things, and I don't know whether it's worthwhile trying to list. It's always worthwhile, in my opinion, to try to list different ways, different models for talking about things. I think we've talked about this in terms, first of all, fragmentation. That would be something that I guess happens to objects and to time, right? Things begin to break up, time segments begin to break up, and so on. We talked about it in terms of reification. That would be something a little bit different. That would be feelings being crystallized as objects, relationships being felt to be objects, and so on and so forth, people being felt to be objects, I guess, too. We can talk about it also in terms of depersonalization, because this is something that happens to the subject, and this is to be understood. This is very important, really, for both sets of works, but especially for Lewis, because there's also a dialectical paradox in this notion of depersonalization. We see it on the literary level already at work in Flaubert. Flaubert wants to get the writer out of the work. That is to say, it's not just because he loathes himself, that he doesn't want himself inscribed in this object, which is going to be, which has, if you take the Sartrean explanation, some sort of surrogate value for him, is going to represent his eternity or something. It's not just for those psychological reasons. No, rather the presence of the old-fashioned omniscient narrator that Flaubert is trying to get rid of which he doesn't get rid of, incidentally, because people have gone through L'Éducation sentimentale and found innumerable interventions of Flaubert into that text. I mean, so it's a... And Madame Bovary also, yeah. But L'Éducation sentimentale is even more striking because it is already more depersonalized, and so it's more sort of stunning to find these things. I mean, as though Flaubert forgot, but he's working so close, you see, that he can tend to forget. The famous example is Madame Bovary's eyes, which on page 30 are blue, and on page 150 are brown, I think, because when you're writing things sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, it's hard to keep all those larger things in. So this is happening already in Flaubert, this depersonalization. It's a way of getting rid of the social relationship between the artist and the public. Now, this is, of course, not a personal decision on Flaubert's part. It's happening in reality. That old contract between writer and public is being broken up by the market. Now the market will sell these works, and perhaps. I don't know who's. I've never really found this worked out. It's an interpretation of Romanticism that Hobsbawm uses in his book, The Age of Revolutions, and he attributes it to Ernst Fischer, but I haven't really found the original text. But it's an interesting idea. He says, what Romanticism is that the market creates a crisis in this older institutional situation of the artist. The artist no longer has an institutional, socially institutionalized relationship to a determinate public. Suddenly, in the market, he has to sell himself. Well, then, and sell these things. You don't have patrons anymore. You don't have the courts. That's all gone. You don't have the salons. Even that was already sort of worked on by commercialism, as you can see in Le Neveu de Rameau and so forth. But nonetheless, there's still a kind of stable set of relationships there. Now, in the 19th century, suddenly, that's all gone. Well, what is the product that the artist is going to sell? Because he doesn't have anything. Well, what he sells then becomes his genius, the greatness of his soul. And so in this interpretation of Hobsbawm, the whole romantic doctrine of genius and the whole dramatization of self-dramatization of genius by these various poets and so forth is essentially a stage in which they're working up into a commodity for this market, for the early bourgeois market, something which is uniquely precious and saleable. So far from being a reaction against the market and against the bourgeois order, which Romanticism also is, right? That's its utopian component. It is a critique of capitalism. It is also ideologically an expression of capitalism, and a kind of inner expression of the market system. At any rate, I find that an intriguing interpretation to play with, but by the time we get to Flaubert, there's no longer any possibility of that. That is, I think everybody knows that the market process has gone too far. There aren't any great souls anymore. Flaubert would like to have, in his early writings, you have a lot of attempts to whip himself up into a Byronic soul and so forth in these unpublished things, but that's not a saleable commodity anymore. So now there has to be something new, and that will be the text which will be sold. And the process of getting the object, language as an object, and this will, if it can be sold, and this will involve eliminating the last remnants of the interpersonal social situation, which is that of producer-consumer. That is, getting rid of the traces of the writer, getting rid of the traces also then of the reader, and producing this completely impersonal, depersonalized language object, which will be Flaubert, which will be Mallarmé, which will be then modern writing. So depersonalization, in that sense, is yet another form taken by this process. And some of us talking the other day about how about the play of pronouns in Flaubert, how you get a kind of, it's in all modern writing, you get little by little a kind of substitution of pronouns for names. Your older 19th century novel will always place everything on a fine day at such and such a Mr. So-and-so, place, name, all the rest of it. Whereas the modern novel, or Henry James, will begin he. Okay, now this is sort of funny because in a way it seems to me that one must say that this is a kind of depersonalization. But then we have to understand that there's a dialectical thing going on here, that this depersonalization of writing, getting rid of the older places for characters and also readers and writers and so forth, is accompanied in compensation by a kind of immense increase in the charge of subjectivity that the work has. But that subjectivity is no longer, how can I say, the subjectivity of the subject. It's no longer the personality, the individual personality. It is depth psychology, let's say. Right? This subjectivity is the subjectivity of the universe of Freud, and no longer the universe of the 19th century realistic novel. And that's why all of a sudden these books get transformed into these libidinal apparatuses that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about in connection with Lewis. So those are three features of this process: depersonalization, fragmentation, reification. And no doubt there are many more. And I think one of the things that we can do, these things are also going in the direction of their. At least we can see now from our vantage point that they're going in the direction of a kind of both an ideology and a form which will fulfill these features. And this is, I think, what now has come to be called the text, and which we will be able to see either in its schizophrenic variant or in terms of its postmodernism or whatever. But it seems to me that when we read again, if you haven't, Culler's little book on Flaubert, because I think that's a very powerful expression of this ideology that's coming into being now around the notion of text. Now, linguists want to tell us everything is a text. There have always been texts. Well, I'm using it in a much more historicized sense, that really text in that sense is something modern. Text is the form of unity that you get when in these things of Flaubert that we've read, we have to piece the relationships back from paragraph to paragraph. That is when really reading becomes a matter of sewing these various things together in a kind of minute way and no longer of apprehending larger represented unities. How can I put it? In a kind of representational writing, you have the writing is a kind of means to an end, and that end is something still understood to be a kind of unity. That is the unity of action, something you're supposed to see, a scene you're supposed to see, a feeling you're supposed to recognize, experience or something. In the construction of text, this turns around, it seems to me. And little by little, what was a means becomes the end in itself. That is now reading, piecing together things. In that experience, in the representational thing, we have to do reading operations too. That is, we have to keep track of the characters, make connections. We have to have this sort of constant experience of you may or may not know this term, which is coming to be one of the currently fashionable ones, and you can see this kind of dictated by the very problems of analyzing a text. The notion of the anaphora. That is, that's a form which it's a trope whereby a reference sends you back to its antecedent. So in a way, these are the kinds of strings or protensions and retentions in Husserl's sense that hold sentences together in some larger unity, which is a textual unity. Well, all written texts, Homer or oral texts, do something like that, clearly, and there's always been a reading process that did that. But this is the first time that this reading process has been foregrounded and become the central thing that you write a book for. And here, I guess, well, my reference would be as much, certainly Lewis forces you, these books don't allow you to forget that you're busy reading, and that reading is a complicated operation, and you're having to do this all the time, and you can't really do it automatically. But the example I was going to give, partly because I'm also doing that in another course, is Rebrier, where you can't really, at every moment you know that you're piecing together writing. I mean, so suddenly what was the object of the thing has become just the pretext, that's the story or something, and what was merely the instrument has really become an end in itself, namely the reading process. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we were talking about that last week, you and I. I mean, the thing is, of course you can do this to the writing of the past. But as I have said to my friend Hillis Miller on a similar occasion, well, it was his Cranford talk that he gave here a couple years ago, I think, Mrs. Gaskell's Cranford, which is a very gemütlich and traditional British 19th century novel. I said, what's marvelous about this is that when you get all done with this, it looks like Philippe Solers. I mean, it looks like postmodernism. And I have to feel that, that while that's very interesting, and that's certainly a level of any kind of reading and writing, there's got to be something perverse, historically perverse, about something that turns Milton into, let's see, what would we say, Wallace Stevens or whatever, or that turns 19th century novels into Solers. I mean, that cannot be the center of those texts in the way it is in modern texts. That's my point. That is, they end up being texts also, but without desiring to. Now, of course, there is mannerism. See, and that was Fish's object in these self-consuming artifacts, and I think he doesn't really confront that problem seriously there either, because he makes it into an eternal kind of opposition between readerly and writerly or something in Barth's terms, as said. But it seems to me, on the contrary, it's a historical question. If a certain kind of writing begins to overflow its boundaries like that, and begins to become reflexive, the way modernism does, but it's only an analogy, then we want to know a little more about that historically. Why is it that this happens at this point? Those things he doesn't deal with, to my mind. Now, maybe you feel...
Well, I just wonder, the process is transferred back to the older texts. I just wonder whether
I think it's all. I think there's a kind of process of projection involved here, where you sort of you're in the ideology of the new. This is sort of the standard ideology of modernism since the beginning. You know, what's new is good. What's innovation is good, and these old things are different or metaphysical or something. But then you find yourself, as with reading Balzac. So if you want to work with that, then you sort of make it into something new, and so you rewrite it. These are rewriting operations, I think, and I guess we all do that to a certain degree. But I think one has to raise the issue of history. Now, I have another essay which is in this, which was published in Salmagundi, which is in this collection of things I have on reserve over here, called "The Ideology of the Text," precisely, which is a kind of review of Essed and of Culler's book. And I try to make this point there, and I think this is still the position that I would want to hold, that the problem of this realism-modernism, I probably said this before already, that this whole realism-modernism opposition, whether you take it from the side of Lukács, which is that realism is good, modernism is bad, or from the side of the modernists, and that would be either the classical generation of Pound or tel quel, Barthes, Kristeva, Solers, and so on, that modernism is good and realism is bad. It seems to me that when one is locked into that binary opposition, like all binary oppositions, it becomes an ethical thing, first of all, good and bad. And there's no way of getting out of it, because this thing generates itself and kind of generates false problems. I propose there to rehistoricize that whole thing, to make those into historical categories, and to add on, that is, then they would be the categories of classical capitalism, realism, société de consommation, modernism, or postmodernism. Maybe there's some stages in there, I don't know. And then I think one wants to add some other stages, and I would suggest that at that point you can only understand realism in a really historical way if you see that behind realism is yet an earlier stage, which is that of what I call classical storytelling, and which corresponds, I think, to the commercial moment of nascent capitalism, as one finds it in pre-capitalist societies of various types. And there my basic text would be Benjamin's text, The Storyteller, where he shows the relationship precisely between commercial experience of distance and so on, and these stories, whether they're of the 1001 Nights or Boccaccio or whatever. And I think if one does that, then one's out of the Spinnery opposition, and one can deal with these things in history. One is also beyond good and evil in the sense that we don't have to worry whether modernism is good anymore or realism is bad. I mean, that becomes a meaningless question, which is what it ought to be, to my mind. But I think if it's not thought through to the point where these things are historicized, then you're back in this kind of thing. And I think Fish is caught in it, and all these other people are in various ways. It's a very interesting kind of thing to watch because it's the logic of the problem. I mean, you can't get out of it. You know? So I think while I think Fish does a lot of interesting stuff, for me, it would have to be really usable, it would have to be reevaluated in a very different framework than the one he's willing to permit himself. Well, there I think this is, well, it's also Sarraute in her essay on Flaubert. Yeah, there I think they're on safer ground in this sense that Flaubert is a very ambiguous thing, and I think you have a nascent modernism and a perfected realism going on there all at once, and I think these are not really period categories of the chronological type. You understand? They're description of forces that are in process, which can in any moment coexist. You know, as for example in Romanticism. I guess in the Romantic moment, the very earliest moments, you have at one and the same time something which is a proto-modernism and the beginnings of realism. I mean, so we don't have to sort them out like that. But I think in Flaubert, it's clear that the whole fascination and also the ambiguity of the thing is that all that stuff is going on at once, and you can read it either way. And there, I think one isn't doing violence to it, and I think historically, it's the fountainhead of both things. That is, it leads into naturalism, and then beyond that into the bestseller and popular culture, and it leads into modernism, and that's the strand we've been following. But we could have followed the other one too. It would have been no less appropriate, I think. Did you have a point? Well, we're essentially talking, I think, about we're still talking about cultures in which, to use these terms, the bourgeoisie is hegemonic, and in which its culture tends to dictate the terms of all of the various solutions that are found, which doesn't mean that there won't be oppositional currents possible. But of course, they're possible only owing to the existence of oppositional communities and so forth. That is, I think it's very important to understand that culture can only be produced from a community, so that what I'm describing in this realism modernism business is essentially various stages of bourgeois culture. That is, a kind of stage in which there was a really powerful ideological task of bourgeois culture to represent, in classical Lukácsian terms, I think, the totality of society and so forth. And then a kind of increasing sense that was no longer possible, that the bourgeoisie itself was atomized, because you see one of the features of reification in late capitalism is that it affects the ruling class as well as the other classes. That is to say, ennui, fragmentation, existential angst, all that stuff, alienation and so on, are themselves, have themselves happen to especially to the dominant, the hegemonic class. And so the whole operation of the market system, which wants to be a corrosive, an analytical operation that destroys older communities, that destroys organic forms and relations and so on, ends up destroying even the class cohesion of the bourgeoisie. so that it's in its own culture that it experiences this crisis. And then modernism will be an attempt, in the way we described yesterday, to reflect that crisis, but also maybe to compensate for it. That is, to express it ideologically, to make it worse in some ways. And that's Lukács's idea. You know, Lukács would say, look, at a book like this only reinforces reification. Look how reified this is, you know. But at the same time, it attempts, I think, very powerfully to produce a breathing space and to compensate for it. So I think that's the whole drama of modernism in the sense that I'm thinking. Part of what? No, these are the classic terms of 19th century. They're the terms of Marx, you know. Huh? Well, what we're applying to older society are completely different categories. That is, I would only range in this row of things an earlier stage of the market. But I think beyond the commercial experience, which gave rise to this kind of storytelling, there are completely different forms of art, which are pre-capitalist forms of art, which have nothing to do with any of this. And which also have their survivals and our kinds of things too. There, I think, I call that allegory or myth or something, and I consider that to be quite discontinuous with this whole set of things. But I don't think it's a question of projecting back into the, I mean, we're clearly making up a model of the past. We're making a historical. Well, make another one and we'll see how good it is. You see, I think we tend to argue about these things, the text of history. If history's a text, then how can we do anything historical, you know, because it's so arbitrary? Well, sure, history's a text, but it's not just any old text. That's the key to the text of history. And so if one says, well, you're making up a picture of the past and one could make up other ones, well, let's make up some other ones. And then let's compare these things and see, you know, see how they work and see which ones are, that was essentially my, the way that I dealt with this alternate explanation of ennui and angst and reification, which is the existential one, you know, that life is meaningless. For the first time, Heidegger, see, for the first time we've broken through to an understanding that of being, but also of nothingness, that we've touched again this reality of existence, which is that existence is meaningless and so forth. Well, that's a powerful alternate vision. It's also a historical vision, you know, because Heidegger has to explain why we didn't know this before and so on. But I think that's not an adequate picture of history or explanation. But I think then one can argue, you know, and then one can say what are the merits of these positions. But I think the one thing one can't say, one thing one can't say is since this is nothing but a model of history, then it's not binding. What one can say is that history is meaningless. I mean, I think that is the final. That's the final position of retreat from, or the final kind of containment position on all this. And that people have done. Lyotard is, I guess, the most powerful contemporary spokesman for this, attacking his own sort of cousins in this post-structuralist enterprise. He attacks Baudrillard, for example, in whom, although he's a critique of Marxism, he's a kind of post-structuralist, he's a critique of structuralism, but he's also has some Rousseauian tendencies and kind of attachment to the notion of some kind of primitive life, what he calls a symbolic. Lyotard against him says, no, what we have to say is there never were any primitive societies. History doesn't exist. It's always been like this. Primitive societies are capitalistic. What we find in capitalism in the present has always been the case. Well, this is Nietzsche's whole attack on history, and I think it is, you know, if one really wants to resist history, I think one is slowly forced back into that final position, and I suppose at that point it becomes an absolute and there's nothing to say about it. I mean, sure, if one wants to say that history is radically meaningless in that sense, then there's no response. But then you've got to invent a way of living in that. Okay, yeah, other thoughts? Yeah. Well, I don't think so. No, not all of them by any means. You see, Foucault is certainly in a very different kind of history. He's a historian for one thing, and he's in a kind of political history or history of power. I think Derrida, there is one side of Derrida is in great sympathy with this Nietzschean idea of a perpetual present, and thinks that every picture of historical succession is a myth, or is a metaphysic and so forth. But another side of him doesn't, and I think it's not at all clear. I think there's a great ambivalence there. And as I say, Baudrillard certainly, and when you get to classical structures of Lévi-Strauss, that's Rousseau. And that's quite different. And Lacan, I think, is very, insofar as there is a theory of history in Lacan, it can be assimilated to historical materialism, he says so himself. So, this is quite varied in these people. But certainly the presence of Nietzsche in post-structuralism is a very emblematic thing, because it means on one level, the primacy of the symbolic, a whole philosophy of the primacy of the symbolic, but also on another level, this refusal of history, refusal of utopia, refusal of the historiographic or the vision of history. Now, today we know where that leads, because we have the nouveau philosophes, who have really drawn some political conclusions from this. And as I said, I think way back at the beginning of all this, I think there are historical reasons for this fear of history happening right now, because history is closer than it once was. If you were a Marxist in the 50s in France, you could talk about revolution all you wanted, because it really was, because really the world situation was relatively immobilized. There was the Soviet Union and the United States, and France was sort of caught in the middle, and you could talk about Marx, but you couldn't do anything much about it. Then there were wars of national liberation, which were offered different kinds of action, but not anything central. But now, clearly, rightly or wrongly, I think there is a reality in this situation that these Western European countries are on the point of a very different kind of relationship to radical social change, and with Eurocommunism. And so suddenly, they have to decide whether those things they used to be talking about, French intellectuals, whether that was what they really had in mind. And I think suddenly the way that the process of politicization takes place, it is a much more visceral thing. And a lot of these people have found out that really they weren't Marxists after all. And the whole operation of the Nouveau Philosophe is designed, I think, to make it henceforth acceptable, which it wasn't, for you to be not only non-Marxist but anti-Marxist in France today, and remain an intellectual, and not be, as you would have been in the 50s and 60s, a kind of lackey of the establishment or something. So this is a whole operation, I think, which is produced by a very real historical situation, and in that operation, I think this position of Nietzsche is very, very central, or offers some useful ideological things. Again, this is quite a different Nietzsche from the one I mentioned yesterday. Any other thoughts about this? Well, why don't we go back? I don't want to stay away from this text for too long, because I want us to look at how this operates. At any rate, what I was trying to prepare for was this idea that in a way, this text, therefore, necessarily has two levels. It has one level in which the writer registers reification or flux. And then it has another level, and that's something the writer does. Clearly this is not a passive receptive thing. He makes himself a registering apparatus, sure, if you like, but he's got to write these sentences, so this is something he does. So in a way, he creates the flux as well as registering. On another level, then he tries to master it or reorganize it. He takes it as the broken bits and pieces, which will now be reassembled into new forms. And both these things are going on at once in the text. So what emerges from this is a kind of split-level text, which is deliberately that way, in which you have both things going on at once. You have given to you a flux, and then you have given to you a powerful but momentary reorganizations. And I think that certainly is at least one of the secrets of the terrific energy of this book, because you see a process of production at work. That is, it's not, and you read it at work, and you cooperate with it. It seems to me Conrad, obviously much energy is involved in Conrad too, but we don't have the sense of energy in Conrad. On the contrary, we have a sense of, and one's reading stance has to be very different. It's a kind of contemplative thing. because it seems to me that it's important in Conrad that production, literary production this time, production of sentences, must be disguised and concealed back underneath a surface, a kind of myth of reception and impressions, right? Because in Conrad we must live the idea that this is really the forms of the external world which are dictating this poetry and so forth. So that it seems to me that in Conrad this energy, or this, what Kristeva calls la productivité dit texte, that is the point at which text and productivity become one and the same. In Conrad, this is somehow still repressed or disguised. But in Lewis, it's very open. And I think it's open in lots of different ways. First, by the whole theme of art, which comes to dominate the novel. It's open in the very process of reading, and so forth. So I think this accounts for the sensation of energy that one gets in reading this, and for some of the, if you like this kind of text, for the kind of, for its, how can I put it, its spiritual uses, so to speak. That is, it seems to me that this is a kind of energy book. It's a book to be used that way, in a way that many others might not be, or might be designed to be used for something else. So we have these two levels, which are reformed. Now, I've said that in this, I have various formulations in this essay. I think it's a funny kind of thing, although probably one could find equivalents in other modern works. What it reminds me of is, for example, theatrical double levels. In the theater, one of the things about all theater, I don't know, but at least about some theater, and certainly one of the dominant things that comes to happen in the modern theater, is this sense that you have, that we have on the one hand a book, a scenario, that's the text of the play, and then on the other hand we have its interpretation by the actors, and that really these are two levels that are existing in the theatrical text. So when you see a Shakespeare play, you're really very aware, it's a kind of Brechtian estrangement effect, you're very aware that you have a primary text, and then Peter Brook or Peter Stein or somebody is doing something miraculous to this primary text and is interpreting it, and you're looking at both at once, and you have to. Because if you think that Shakespeare is just Peter Brook, then you miss this sense of transformation which is present in the interpretive process. Now, Brecht is the theoretician of this in the sense, although he doesn't really work it out in quite these terms, in the sense that that's what Brecht said a play should be. A play should have these two levels. A play should have a level of the raw material, and then the sense that the actors are commenting on this raw material. They're taking their characters, he says, and they're sort of holding them at distance. So in Stanislavski, if a character feels anger, the actor has to become at one with that character, and we have to have a sort of perfect unified vision of anger. This is the older idea of the organic unity of the work of art and so forth. But for Brecht, when a character is supposed to play anger, a character must be seen to be imitating an actor playing anger, see? So in Brecht you have to feel that the two things are going on at once, that you have this original text and then you have commentary. And the actual acting is a commentary on the text. Well, like something like that is going on in Lewis too, that we're given an initial flux. And it's a flux which really, in Lewis, could very easily touch the schizophrenic, and it does, I think, in the Children Mass. That is, there's a point at which all of these objects could lose their names, and it does in Chrysler, of course. But in this work, Chrysler is still positioned and put in a perspective whereby Chrysler is still felt to be pathological or an aberration, because we still have tar. What would happen suddenly, this is the drama of later Lewis, if we didn't have tar to contain Chrysler anymore? If Chrysler were the ground base, or the fundamental experience of reality, and no longer one of its aberrant possibilities, well, then we'd be in the pure schizophrenic flux. And it's clear that Chrysler is Chrysler's experience is not. This is not an experience of a subject. You know, there isn't any person. The characters keep saying that. No, what is it? What is a Chrysler? Bertha says she thinks there might be certain kinds of wild animals. You have certain varieties. One is called Chrysler, another is called tar, and what you sort of see species of these wild animals. You have to negotiate them in daily life. You take your precautions and so forth. Or at another point, and this is even more striking, she says in the great the great climactic rape scene, which is the one of the great climactic scenes at any rate. This is the way she thinks about this experience of the immediate past. Afterwards, she sees several Chryslers. There's one who did this to her, one who was standing there beforehand, one who's standing there afterwards. The monotony and silence of the posing had prepared her for the strangeness now. The other extreme joined hands with this. She saw side by side and unconnected the silent figure, this is Chrysler, the silent figure engaged in drawing her bust, and the other one full of blindness and violence. Then there were two other figures, one getting up from the chair, yawning, and the present lazy one at the window. Four in all that she could not for some reason bring together, each in a complete compartment of time of its own. It would be impossible to make the present idle figure at the window interest itself in these others. Now, if you know about this kind of thing, this then gets much more fully developed in some kinds of science fiction. I mean, that's one genre that has somehow taken over this kind of experience, and there's a very beautiful story of Ballard where time begins to break down like this, and suddenly you begin to, well, but there are a lot of science fiction things that do this. Your various selves and your various moments of the past multiply themselves and other moments of the past. And in short, what's happening here is that the unity of the personality is breaking down. The unity of time is breaking down. Now, it was this unity of time and of the personality and of the ego which is responsible for, well, what in Lacan will be the whole notion of the illusion of the subject, or what in Marxian language would be the illusions, I guess, of bourgeois individualism. The idea that there is a substantial organic unity which is myself, which exists in time, goes from past to future, which has a continuity and unity about it. This, for whatever reason, and whatever reality that experience had, or that ideology had, this is registering its breakdown. So at this point, we see as a kind of ultimate term a world in which each Chrysler, each moment of each Chrysler would be so separate from the other that we couldn't talk about a character anymore, that we couldn't talk about temporal continuities. Names are temporal continuities, after all, hence the whole fascination with the notion of the Anaphora. The Anaphora is the very ground of the way that these temporal continuities are inscribed in language. That's why naming is so paradoxical, because names are, how is it that a name, that objects have this kind of continuity throughout language? And is not a name a kind of elaborate fiction like the notion of ego or self, which makes you think that this room has some kind of supratemporal existence that was here last week, it's going to be here next week, and so on, and perpetuates you in a view of reality, Croft Chapel House, which is really completely unjustified. These become, in contemporary reflection, linguistic problems, and I think that's where they become most interesting in post-structuralism and so on. That is, one is able to push this thing through in both directions, through psychoanalysis to sort of ultimate questions about the self, the ego, schizophrenia, and so on, and through to language, to ultimate questions about what the continuity of language is, continuities of meanings. If everything is a text in that sense, well, then what we have to accentuate is precisely the discontinuities of text, and we have to precisely find some reasons how not any longer about language in general. We have to even persuade ourselves how it's possible for language to be a vehicle for these continuities. I mean, in a sense, if we begin from Deleuze's point of view, or from the point of view of this experience, that our fundamental experience of reality is a flux, then the basic question about language is how it could be anything but schizophrenic language. You know, how there could be something that overcame this constant recourse to the deictic, essentially, which would be the naming function. That is saying this, you know, not last moment's chair, not tomorrow's chair, but just that one right there. You know? How does language? How can there be such a thing as language which gets us out of that? And then that becomes a central mystery, and then one which is sort of explored by these. I mentioned Culler's book on Flaubert because he's sort of good at taking Flaubert's sentences apart and attacking, that's sort of the best part of the book, attacking ideological readings of Flaubert's sentences. He takes a lot of previous criticism and he says, look at, what are these people trying to do to these sentences? They can't stand the idea that these sentences might be texts. They want to make them into meanings. They want to turn them back into something that's organic and that's, and it's clear when you look closely that really they are trying to do that and they can't do it. And then he's trying to show that these are random collections of words, these Flaubert sentences, and if you look at them properly, you see that one can impose these forms of organization on them, that that's an ideological operation. So what his conclusions, I think, are much more doubtful, but it's a useful kind of reading exercise to look through, to reread with color a few of those sentences of Flaubert, and to see how little of the meanings that we've been tempted to attribute to those sentences are really there in reality. How much are our sort of nervous projections onto these sentences, and how much these sentences are really, in fact, text in this historical discontinuous sense I'm using. Okay, so we have this process of reconstruction going on of what is ultimately a kind of flux. And this takes, I think, various forms, but here, very specifically, the whole notion of combat, struggle, agon, and so on. So it's all rewritten. It's as though we have some original, we have an original raw material that's broken to pieces. What's the original raw material? Well, on one level it's the flux, no doubt, but on another level it's something very boring, namely here's a story about an artist who's having an affair with this German woman, and for whatever reasons, and maybe these are probably ultimately psychoanalytic reasons, we don't know what they are. He certainly has a problem with sex, or has a lot of metaphysical problems with sex, and he wants to break off with her. And we have a scene in which they meet, and he tries to disengage, and she gets the better of him, and so on and so forth. Well, one can imagine this written in a perfectly banal way in some other form of a narrative discourse, right? That is, it seems to me this could be. But so what we have essentially at that level is a banal, boring scene or narrative, which has been rightly felt by Lewis. That is, as a realistic narrative, this no longer is of any interest. That is, these people are marginals. They have no. They have no. They don't do they don't. Compare that to Madame Bovary breaking off with one of her lovers. Let's say. With Rodolphe and Madame Bovary. There we have something which in the realistic moment is still fraught with all kinds of meanings and vibrations which are transmitted through the whole picture of society that you have in Flaubert. At this point, what happens to those characters is of great moment and can be told for itself because it is a vehicle for all kinds of things. At this stage, it's no longer of any interest. It's completely privatized. Nobody cares whether Tar breaks off with Bertha. I mean, nobody cares whether Bertha gets Tar to marry. No, none of those things have any general consequence at all. The whole narrative raw material has been utterly devalued and is now, is now for sale so cheap that, or if you like, this is the property then of commercial literature. And then one could say, sure, well, here we get ladies' romances, the kinds of things that Mr. Bloom thinks of writing little stories for in Ulysses or the Harlequin series or something. I mean, here's told from Bertha's point of view, certainly this is a Harlequin novel. And here's this exotic Englishman, and so on and so forth. It's almost a Gothic novel. Then she runs these perils and so on. So we have a devalued raw material. What do you do with it? You don't want it to be commercialized. That would be the other great path of modern writing. That is, writing in modern times. We saw it happening in Conrad. And you see it also happening in naturalism. That is, you can now decide to be a modernist writer, or you can produce this new thing, which is in a dialectical relationship to modernism, which didn't exist in the 19th century, which is commercial literature, mass culture. And which is really to be understood in a dialectical relationship to modernism. because Balzac was after all, mass culture, in the 19th century. Balzac was a bestseller, Scott was a bestseller, Dickens, and so on. So at that point, the separation hadn't taken place. But in our time, and with Conrad's passage from the Impressionist part of Lord Jim to the Romance part of Lord Jim, I think we're already beginning to see that happen. And it happens in different ways to different people. Well, here, Lewis energetically refuses this, since he doesn't want to be a writer of Harlequin romances. But he's got this raw material. What does he do with it? Well, then he has this other solution, which is to pulverize that initial narrative. Break it into bits and pieces, and then you put it back together in very different forms. So then we have a new kind of narrative, which will be this kind of agon between these characters. It is a struggle, and then we read this with something of the interest that we have for a chess match, because there really are positions, and there's a lot of buried military interest, I guess, that must come out of this. Is written during the war, it must come out of some kinds of military preoccupations in the background. We have a lot of questions of strategy here. If Tar, for example, when he enters the apartment, indications that you're giving when you're storytelling to show that, this is a fully rendered piece of reality. Here, this fact of just sitting down has been transformed and heightened into something else, that is, into a move in a complicated game with counterplay of positions with Bertha. It is a sign, it's a statement in a gambit. And Tar's gambit is, I'm here to eat. And Bertha will understand that, and then she has another gambit. And finally, Tar loses. Because when he finally gets around to saying, I've had it, I want to break off, this is it, she says, yes, break off, you've had it, this is it. And thus she, in her strategy, envelops his and makes this impossible, and so forth. So you have a whole level in which these various the various bits of flux of this whole thing have been put together in a new and artificial sequence, which is one of the gambit or whatever. But at the same time, these things are now preserve a certain episodic quality, and each one of them is going to be developed for its own merits. So we have things like this. Well, here's an example. Let's see. Yeah, here is the kiss, and I wanted to, page 50, I wanted to juxtapose this. Does anyone have a copy of Nostromo handy still? Well, there's several sort of very flamboyant kisses when Nostromo picks the girl up on the horse and so forth, or the great kind of romantic embrace at the end. Well, I think you can see that Conrad is turning that back into a very special kind of decoration, making it into something precisely flamboyant, into a unified kind of gesture and so on, which bears its own kind of romantic weight and emits a kind of romantic message and all the rest. And I think that makes an interesting kind of comparison. If you want to look at that again yourself, you can check it out on page, I think pages, where did I put this? Down somewhere. Oh, yeah, pages 117 to 118 of the Penguin, or later on pages 440, 446. Now, this is what happens in Lewis, however, with the kiss. You haven't kissed me yet, he said in imitation of her. Why kiss you, Sorbert, she managed to say before her lips were covered with his. He drew her ungraciously and roughly into his arms and started kissing her mouth with a machine action. Now, when we get to Deleuze, of course, the machine, you'll understand why bells can ring every time you get the machines evoked here, not only because of Lewis's very real relationship to futurism, I think, and to the mechanical, but because of the very nature of the mechanical. Finally, this will be the description of Chrysler. That is, Chrysler is this thing that goes through these mechanical changes, and you're not sure at what point another one is going to happen. He's like, Bertha says at one point, he's like one of these loading cars that go up to the top and then they shoot back down again, and you get a wholly different set of forces going into play. Finally, she thinks of him, this is later on in the rape scene, she thinks of him as the machine. That is, here's this machine that she has to deal with that's sort of tracking her, and that is, however, unpredictable. So there's Lewis is, of course, very aware of the whole primacy of the mechanical, and this is a slogan and a very, because after all, in another sense, it is the notion of the organic which is archaic. The machine is the affirmation of production. Deleuze, when he comes to the notion of desiring machines, is still talking about the production of the instincts, you see, when the older idea of the unconscious was that, well, there was the organism, and then this organism has these various impulses and instincts and all the rest of it, and so these are going to be transmitted in some kind of organic way, and the unconscious is something buried in the organism and all these things. Well, when you get to Deleuze, the body, what used to be the body, is nothing but a series of desiring machines, as he calls them, which are plugged into each other, and a kind of random assemblage, kind of Rube Goldberg machine in which all these various odds and ends are sort of tied together, and that's really our existential experience of the body. So that what these desiring machines do is produce desire. That is, that's their function. They grind along and produce desire, new desires, new machines, and new machines plug up to the old ones and produce new desires. And you have a kind of circuit, self-producing circuit, in which the body is produced by itself, in which desire is produced by the body, and so on and so forth. Now, this is to underscore, I think, at least that's a very kind of, itself a kind of metaphorical, mythic terminology, if you like, but at least this passage from the organic, and I assimilate Conrad to that in a way, to the mechanical or the metonymic, at least reflects the sense that this new humanized world is a world of production, and a world in which a world which is unnatural in that sense, and therefore in which the very categories of the natural, the organic, are somehow themselves ideological, and this is already pretty clearly happening here. Okay, now this is what happens. Docilely, she covered him with her inertia. He was supposed to be performing a miracle of bringing the dead to life. Okay, now, to read that sentence, what you have to do is you have to translate back through several stages. You have to translate, what is the miracle of bringing the dead back to life? Well, this is the kiss of life, so to speak. She's covering him in some way. He is, she is, his body touching hers is like trying to resuscitate a drowned body, let's say. Okay, so first you have to translate this into its unnamed, into the metaphorical, into the visual picture, which is the source of the metaphor. That is to say, you see one absolutely inert body covered by another one which is trying to administer artificial respiration. Right? So you substitute for this sentence in the reading process that picture. Then you begin to understand the metaphor only at that point. So there's a three-stage thing where you have to see the picture first, then you have to understand the relevance of the picture to this situation. That is to say, Bertha is playing indifference in order to evoke in Tar a little less indifference than really he is brought to this whole business. And that's why she's the corpse and he's resuscitating her. But in Lewis, it's always the other way around too, you see, because really he's the corpse and she's the one that's trying to resuscitate him. So it's a much more complicated figure than that. And only then can you transfer all that back to the sentence and read the sentence properly, you see. So we have a play of substitutions that's at work here, which makes this a very complicated thing to do, and which you have to do. Hence, again, I think the sense of you have to produce this meaning, finally. And that's, again, I think the source of this feeling of energy that there is. Okay, he was supposed to be performing a miracle of bringing the dead to life. Gone about too crudely, the willing mountebank, death, had been offended. It is not thus that great spirits are prevailed upon to flee. Her indifference, the great simulated and traditional, would not be ousted by an upstart and younger relative. Now, all of these sentences say the same thing, namely, he's got to really work at this. She's going to pretend to be absolutely indifferent, and he must bring to this a certain kind of flamboyance of his own. That is, he must really show some interest, and only at that point will this simulacrum of death, which he's pretending, be put to flight. But we're appealing to quite different vocabulary fields for all this. I mean, the first one was the artificial respiration one. Now we're in almost high Renaissance poetry, you know, death or Elizabethan poetry, the willing mountebank, and so on. And so forth. So all of these are various alternates which are given us in order for us to reconstruct this new, how can I put a hyper situation, which is being constructed on the ruins of the old realistic one. And I think there, if I can anticipate a little bit, things that probably we won't have time to do today, I think this is, again, in one way or another, the structural secret of all modernism, that it is it is not a rediscovery of the primitive, as some modernists have tried to claim. It is rather a repressed realism. It's a way of building on realism and then forgetting it in the terms of our discussion yesterday. That is, at the source of this modern text is a buried realistic text. And to read it, we have to sort of reconstruct that realistic text, if only to abandon it again. But the realistic text is still down there underneath somewhere, but it is repressed in this Nietzschean Husserlian sense of being forgotten, that is, only its bits and pieces remain. Its spirit is no longer useful and has to be somehow done away with, and this new kind of construction comes into being. And I think we can see that here in the very way we have to read this. Well, okay. There are a lot of other things I think one could say about this section, but I think you get the idea of the kind of reading, both the nature of this reading and the way these scenes are sort of largely organized, the kind of problems that these scenes present. Because a little bit further on, and you won't have scenes at all. You see, you'll have nothing but impressions. You have nothing but fragments, I guess. And that, I think, is why you have this terrific resistance of Lewis. Lewis becomes an anti-modernist, and this is sort of interesting for us, as we'll see. But that's why you have this terrific resistance of Lewis even here to maybe other tendencies. For example, Lewis had a real hatred and loathing for the whole Bloomsbury group, especially Virginia Woolf, because obviously if you add anti-intellectualism to misogyny, she becomes a marvelous kind of target. And he had an almost physical, visceral loathing for that kind of writing. But in another way, it's sort of the structural temptation of this, you see, that you ultimately, the text breaks down into these absolutely unrelated fragments, and you can't energetically reassemble them. They don't reassemble. See, here we still compensate for the broken fragments, the aimlessness of the flux, by reworking all this into really one of the archetypes of relationship, namely the violent struggle. And so we're really compensating by drawing back, and all of Lewis's work is organized around struggle. Everything in Lewis is almost has these two positions, and all the great scenes are dual scenes, and he says this himself at some point. I think I quoted in that place. Why? Because that's the strongest guardrail one can imagine against this breakdown into complete fragments. But clearly in Virginia Woolf and in the sort of loss of energy that you find in To the Lighthouse or something, there are other principles of organization there, but they're not what he wants, obviously. But the kind of sense of kind of aimless, that's a kind of, Virginia Woolf would be, let's say, a Conrad who had to deal with the life world of Lewis, with the world of the flux. It's still impressions. It's highly subjectivized in the Conrad sense, and yet at this point we don't have Conrad's means of containing those things anymore. And so we do have nothing but a kind of passive stream of these various things. Well, it's easy to see why then Lewis would be so resistant to that, because it really is that which he wants to avoid at all costs. And one of the ways of avoiding it is this containment strategy of of the violent struggle, in which, as we saw last time, even indifference becomes a form of struggle, right? That is, even when Tar meets somebody like Hobson that he has no kind of interest in at all, Lewis converts that into an agon and into a fight. Okay, so much for those sides of things. Now, I want to talk, we don't have a whole lot of time left. I do want to get to this business of national allegory and Chrysler and so on. And we'll leave a little of this maybe for next time and for the children mass and so forth before we start talking about Beckett. See, I think you have to read it something like this. This is a book, we said this last time too, this is a book which starts out by not being anything that could be written. That is, it starts out being a pure artist novel, Tar, art versus life. And after all, nothing is more banal in the whole fin de siècle than this whole conception. It's a kind of, it's a kind of Cubist Platonism in a way. I mean, what it says is life is this horrible, messy, sticky, organic place dominated by sex, and later on for Lewis, dominated by time. And the only way of dealing with that is getting out of it into art, which is the whole conceptual realm of forms, which is life is the organic place of sex, time, and ultimately death. All this is spelled out for us in the book, of course. You have, let's see here, pages, in this final conversation with Anastasia, pages 279. This is the essential point to grasp. Death is the thing that differentiates art and life. Art is identical with the idea of permanence. Art is a continuity and not an individual spasm. But life is the idea of the person. No, art is merely the dead, then no, but deadness is the first condition of art. The armored hide of the hippopotamus, the shell of the tortoise, feathers and machinery, you may put in one camp, machinery. Naked, pulsing, and moving of the soft inside of life, along with the elasticity of movement and consciousness, that goes into the opposite camp. Deadness is the first condition for art. The second is absence of soul in the human and sentimental sense. With the statue, its lines and masses are its soul. No restless, inflammable ego is imagined for its interior. It has no inside. Good art must have no inside. That's capital. Well, you can tie that back into period aesthetics. Hume, T.E. Hume is the great theoretician of something like this and sort of the proto-imagism and so on. This notion of art should be hard. Art should be hard surfaces and not mushiness, and not symbolic mushiness, not subjective, introspective mushiness, and so on and so forth. And out of that you get Pound's imagism and you get a lot of other things. And it's quite characteristic of this sort of moment of immediate pre-World War I modernism, and futurism comes out of this, and everything else. And I read you Lawrence's comments on something similar and so forth. But it's banal, see, in the form of ideas. And I don't know what we would do with it if that's all there were in Lewis. I think we're going to find, however, that it organizes a lot of other things, and it has a very different kind of function. Now, at this stage, however, my point is that this is a story. This is a non-tellable story, or insofar as it's tellable, it's already been told. It exists in the form of a play by one of Lewis's great models, and I don't think people have noticed this, but I don't think enough has been made of it, because Lewis is somebody that people always, when you list your idée reçue of modern literary history, what you say is, oh yes, there's the modernists, that's Pound, Eliot, Joyce, Lewis, and Yeats, and then there's this and that. But Lewis is really not to be associated with those people, I think. Rather, Lewis's great model in a lot of this, especially later on, is Shaw. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest Shaw was a music critic, Lewis is an artist. They're both Nietzscheans, but it's two different kinds of Nietzsche. One is a feminist, the other's an anti-feminist. One is a socialist, the other's a fascist. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Lewis is really very interested in, because Shaw is the great political artist, of this period. And we haven't even today come to terms with that, I think. I mean, Shaw was a massive figure in this whole period, and very important politically, very important, at least in the a very crucial figure in the whatever kind of cultural revolution it was that brought social democracy to England. Shaw's contribution is absolutely essential in all that. And Lewis knows this, and the book he's rewriting is Man and Superman, which, as you remember, is the story of how an intellectual whose province is words and ideas and so on finds himself unable not to be sucked in by the life force and has to resign himself to being whirled away by life and ultimately by marriage and so on. And that's the non-story, which would be the story of Tar. How does Tar get in life, get out of life, and so on? Well, but it is a non-story. Now, Shaw can bring it off for different kinds of reasons, I guess. But this is essentially a non-narrative. So what happens is that, as we said the other day, this narrative breaks down, and we have to have a new one. Or it has to compensate its lack of narrativity by producing something more narratable, and that's Chrysler, clearly. Now, overall, it's pretty easy to see. I mean, you could make a pretty sort of banal structural analysis of this in terms of exchange. That is, clearly, the final point is how, the problem to be solved is how does Chrysler get liberated from Bertha? And, I beg your pardon, how does Tar get liberated from Bertha? Okay, and the whole thing is then a kind of process of structural exchange whereby Chrysler enters the picture in order to achieve this ultimate liberation. So they exchange, Chrysler takes Bertha, Tar takes Anastasia, so on and so on, and you have a kind of very symmetrical thing, which is even said in the book at one point. He says 4 is more neat to work with than 3, and so on, so they add Anastasia. And you have a kind of exchange system whereby finally this is brought off, and you could make a kind of analysis of it in that sense. But I think what's more interesting is what that initial structure, which is sort of demanded by the plot, if you like, it's a way of, it's a way of introducing experience and narrative into something that has no experience. That is, this is to be an artist novel. Well, there's always a problem about the artist novel. It's what is it about? What is the story? In this case, Lewis goes to the ultimate extreme, I think, because the sentences really do write all of Lewis's paintings for us, and the experience of the sentence really. Normally, in the artist novel, Bloch has a wonderful essay on this called the novel of the artist, the novel, and the detective novel, as the two archetypes of utopian form. He says each one of them has a hole in the center of it. Each of these forms is interesting because at the very center of what looks like narrative, there's a blank space. That would be, in the artist novel, the painting that's supposed to be done, the novel that's supposed to be written, the music that's supposed to be composed, and normally artist novels can't handle that. You know, you have Thomas Mann describing this music, but that's about as successful, or Proust, that's about as successful as one gets. Otherwise, you just don't believe that Stephen is going to write a novel, or the painting that Zola describes in L'Oeuvre is just not visualizable, and so on. Meanwhile, the detective story also has a hole in it, that is to say, the crime itself. And for Bloch, in his system, this is the way in which the form makes its own critique of itself and projects a notion of a utopian future. That is, this is the sort of emptiness of the present that projects this, this ultimate future. Well, here in Lewis, oddly, I think Lewis really doesn't have that problem. I mean, because he gives us a painting here, and we might look at that in a moment, but every sentence is the same as the experience of Lewis's pictures, and I think there's an odd way in which the problem is displaced. But from a narrative point of view, there's nothing to say. If the artist is out of time, out of life, out of experience, there's no longer anything to be said about him. Right? So that's why we need Chrysler again. We need the bad artist. We need the artist who can't get out of life, who can't get out of time. And so this initial situation, you want to write a novel about something which is non-narratable, produces a narrative. And it produces this second narrative possibility, which is Chrysler. Okay, now, I think the national situations are to be understood this way, and I guess we'll have to close with this. You have to understand that we have a whole set of, I don't know whether we still do, I guess we still do, but they're different stereotypes. Anyway, there's a whole tradition of stereotypes about the Germans. Normally the Germans, Lawrence is Prussian officer, right? Lawrence, like Lewis, was somebody who had some experience of Germany, after all, which is in this pre-World War I cosmopolitan world, not so unusual, except that most of the great artists and writers that we know in our tradition have been much more oriented towards the Mediterranean than toward Central Europe. I would say that Lewis, more than any of the other great Anglo-Saxon modernists, is somebody who really had some kind of sense of Germany and the German and so on. Now, when you get a picture, Lawrence too, but not in an aesthetic way, I think. When you get something like the Prussian officer, there clearly the picture of the German is the kind of conventional one. The German is the superego, right? Is repression, censorship, and so on. Now, I don't think you can understand this at all unless you understand that for Lewis, Germany isn't that at all. Germany is the id. Germany is the repressed. Germany is here not the dominant power. Germany is not the country of industrialization. It's not the country of military power. It is the downtrodden country. It's the country which is culturally deprived, which is somehow the second best country. And really, you know, this is, I think, a fact of life, of history in Europe as one moves to the east. That is, was true in the First World War, was still true in the Second World War. If you talk to people who were in the German army when it came to Paris, I mean, they're very naive arriving in civilization, you know. I mean, they were, in all proportions kept, they were to Paris what the Russian peasants were when they arrived in Berlin. Of course, there wasn't any Berlin anymore at that point, so they weren't quite matched with this sense of astounding and awe before the acquisitions of civilization. But you have to understand that this is part of Germany's self-image, the image of the Treaty of Versailles. Clearly, that comes later than this, but it re-dramatized it. This is in all Hitler's speeches. Germany is the victim. Germany is not the powerful country, but the weak country. Now, if you put all that together, and clearly that's how Lewis saw it right through. If you put all that together, you understand that the German then figures victimization and repression, and figures what is repressed, figures the id, rather than the superego. On the contrary, tar, in that sense, then becomes the figure for how you control the instincts. I don't know if you want to call that censorship or sublimation or something, but the place where one controls those things. Okay, now go even further. What is the ultimate, who is the object of the duel, ultimately? Well, Soltych, it's very interesting. I mean, he says it's a double, of course. The text tells us, you know, Soltych looks like Chrysler. In fact, physically, Soltych even bore distantly and with polish a resemblance to Chrysler. It was as though he had been compelled to imitate Chrysler all his life, but the material at his disposal being of an unsuitable texture, something rather different had resulted. His handsome face and elegance belied the suggestion. Still, Chrysler and he disliked each other for obscure physiological reasons, perhaps. In some ways, Soltych, and this is the key thing, was his efficient and more accomplished counterpart. So he's the same as Chrysler, but better. He's handsomer, he's more polished, he's also more efficient. And you remember that in this sort of triangle that gets set up, the first form taken, which will later be taken by Anastasia, is taken by Ernst Folk's money. And it's because there's a sort of rivalry for this money, which is a real kind of sexualized thing, which arouses Chrysler's whole wrath. Well, see, Chrysler was the lover of this money before. He's been displaced by Soltych. And what's said, and this is very, I think, very crucial, and not really only a figure of speech, when Chrysler returns to Paris and tries to reconnect with the situation, he finds that it's not possible anymore. Soltych is now in the borrower's position with respect to this fortune. And let me try to find this crucial thing here. What he says, you may have. Um, yeah, he's working on trying to borrow the money. Ah, yes, here. Another one of these, page 80, another one of these out-trumped situations where he's going to ask for money, but then the money he gets, it's clear that that's the last because of the bigger side. So these were the circumstances under which he lost folk. He felt that 100 marks given him as a favor, that's the change, was the last serious bite he would get. It was only gradually that he'd realized of how much more value folks' money now was. And what before was an unorganized mass of specie in which the professional borrower could wallow was now a sound and suitably conducted business. That night, he was presented to the new manager, who was Soltic, you see. Now, then there's another, yes, Ernst had experienced, Soltic did not borrow 100 marks. His system was far more up to date. Ernst had experienced an unpleasant shock in coming into contact with Chrysler's clumsy and slovenly money habits again. Now, Soltic is a Pole. He's a Frenchified Pole. I think you must understand that as part of this whole situation. These Frenchified Poles are a more advanced culture than the Germans. They represent, there's an inferiority resentment on the part of the Germans towards this Polish cosmopolitanism and elegance and so on, and efficiency, and kind of Western efficiency and all the rest of it. So we have here a whole underlying national apparatus at work. And remember then that Chrysler is seconded by the Russians. This is virtually a kind of either anticipation or replay or allegory of the First World War. You have Germany at least imagining itself to be in this victimized position by the great advanced powers and so forth, by sophisticated France, by international England and so on, and in the ideal sort of line of things that the Russians are really sort of allied with the Germans, they being even more backward and so forth. It doesn't work out quite that way in history. But and of course their first act is the destruction of Poland as a kind of, and that is obviously also very deeply part of the history of Central and Eastern Europe, the kind of really successive and brutal dismemberment of Poland. Poland, which for the Russians is certainly the West, you know. Warsaw is still felt to be, you know, if you can get there, if you can take your vacation there from Moscow, you're in the West. And also, in another sense, owing to this influence of France and contacts from France for Germany too. So what's happened is that the narrative has seized on a new system, which is the system of the national representations, national flavors, as Tara calls them someplace, you know. And these national allegories have then given a kind of supplementary organization to what's going on. So now we have something which is really an allegory of the war. Okay? And this is somehow the central fact. The English are a little distant. France becomes the element in which this is played, but this kind of key thing is this violent, floundering gesture of rage and resentment and everything, which ends up destroying poor Soltic. Now, at that point, then, that national allegory becomes, I'd like to say, the kind of libidinal apparatus in which all kinds of other things are invested. And at that point, then, we get Chrysler as the id. And we get, then, at one and the same time, a political allegory and a psychic allegory. And these go together, and the one is not possible without the other. And indeed, I'm not just making this up. If you look through Freud, you see that there's a constant... it's an analogous kind of structure, constant appeal in Freud when he wants to talk about the psyche to the description of a city. So there's constantly, there is a political allegory at work in Freud too. It's as though these things went together, that you were able to give a figure of the psyche, an allegorical, because the Freudianism is an allegory of the psyche, right? There's several indeed. You're able to give a specification to that allegory of the psyche only by drawing on a form of political allegory. Right? And that's what, it seems to me, allows the liberation of all of the other kinds of themes and things that are done in here. That is this sort of really violent and unsurpassed, I think, account of psychic disorder and all the rest of it, but that's enabled by the national allegory, and it wouldn't have been able to be written like that, or even written or put in that form, had that not been the underlying apparatus of investment, let's say, or dispositif libidinal, in which then all those things can find their place. Now, my point about Lewis and the Childermass is that, I said this last time, but maybe it can be more meaningful now, that after the First World War, you don't have that anymore, because there isn't the system of nation states. So now a new kind of political allegory has to come into being in order for these psychic materials to be reinvested, but they're reinvested in a different way, and then that becomes ultimately fascism and communism, or really the four positions in the later human age. Fascism, communism, the Catholic Church, and realpolitik, that is ward healing and sheer meaningless power. So ideological forces, the two great ideological forces, tradition and non-tradition. You can make a Greimas rectangle out of all that. And so we can witness this kind of readjustment of these apparatuses and see what they permit in the way of the narrative. Well, that's really all we have time for today, and I think we may want to go on a little bit with this and with the Childermass next time, and then ultimately move on into Watt. So I'll order those copies of both Watt and The Crying of Lot 49 then for us at Miller's. So let me try to reach you before, if I'm up before 9. Yeah. It may be. Okay, I'll try to call you this evening, if not before 10. If I miss you tomorrow, though, well, you could maybe try to reach me at Hart House or something. Huh? Well, there's the private number of the private rooms now. I don't know what they are, but they're in the directory. Yeah, I'm in room 2, so so there'd be somebody, yeah.
Are you going to be there this evening, or?
Well, I'm not sure when I'll be back, but certainly tomorrow morning, if you wanted to call me before you go. If you don't hear from me, let's say by 9:30, 9:45 or something.
9:30.
Yeah, you'd probably have to leave by then.